Okay, so today will be the second live, yes, out of the 8 that all together constitute the number course. Okay, so let's spend just a little bit of time briefly going over what we did, yes, in the first live. Okay, so in the first live, we talked about how to say the word number. Yes, before you learn how to start using numbers like 1, 17, 3 million, or whatever the number may be, yeah, before you start building and using numbers, you want to know how to say the word number. Okay, so that's why in the first live, we started with page number 2. And on page number 2, it says, before you learn how to use numbers to count, quantify, or label, you have to first know how to say the word number, since you will have to use different versions in different contexts. Okay, so that's why we looked at 4 versions, depending on perspective 3 or 4. Okay, so yes, number 1, it says you use this version, 숫자, when you are simply saying the word number. Okay, I would like to elaborate on that. You could say, what does simply saying the word number mean? Okay, so usually when you have a number that you are using, you're usually using that number for a function that numbers have. Yeah, numbers can do a couple of things. Yeah, you're usually using numbers for either one of these 3 functions. Number 1, to count how many. Yeah, literally when you say something like, yeah, how many people came? Can you count? And let's say my friend is going to say, wait, just give me a second. 1, 2, 3, 17. I'm sorry. Count how many. Okay, so function number 1 would be literal of numbers. Yeah, literally when you are using numbers to count how many of something. Okay, but you can also use numbers for function number 2, right? Not to count how many, but to quantify. Okay, so a typical example could be temperature. Okay, so when we're saying something like 32 degrees, 5 degrees, or whatever it may be, we are using numbers for temperature. Now, is temperature something that you would count by saying how many? When you're checking the temperature, do you say, how many temperatures do we have today? No, we don't count temperature by saying how many. You quantify how hot it is, how warm it is, how cold it is. Okay, so in that case, when you're saying 32 degrees, 5 degrees, whatever the number may be, you're using numbers for function number 2 to quantify. Okay, so number 3 would be to label. Okay, so for example, if my friend says, come to room number 3, room number 3. Now, how do I know which room is number 3? Well, usually there will be a label. So let's say there are multiple doors in this building, multiple rooms. Okay, so if my friend says, come to room number 3, well, how do I know which one is 3? Well, if there's a sign that says number 3, well, this room was labeled number 3. Okay, now I know which room to go to. So in this case, we're using numbers to label, not to quantify and not count how many. Because when my friend says, come to room number 3, yeah, he's not counting how many. He's not telling me, yeah, come to 3 rooms. How many rooms do I have to go to? Oh, come to 3 rooms. That's not what he's saying. And he's not quantifying anything. He's not quantifying like the size of this room or anything. Yes, we're using number 3 to label. Okay, so to count how many, number 2 to quantify, and number 3 label would be the 3 typical functions that numbers have. And when I say label, I am including any kind of a code. For example, like a password. Yes, because, for example, let's say I need to type in the password 1234 to get into some kind of a website. It means that, yeah, there is some kind of current frequency that has to be activated, yeah, for me to log into this website. That, yes, frequency activation is labeled 1234. It's just that only I know what it's labeled. Okay, so when you're using numbers for any kind of a code like a password, I also call that labeling. Also like a phone number. Once again, yeah, some kind of current frequency has to be activated for me to call you, not just any phone, but exactly your phone. So yeah, your phone must have some kind of a current frequency that is labeled. For example, if my phone number is 1234, yeah, then yeah, this is exactly what I have to type in to call you, specifically your phone. Okay, so once again, also a phone number would be some kind of a code and therefore using numbers to label. Okay, so these would be the typical 3 functions that numbers have. Now, that's what I mean by, yeah, simply saying the word number. It means when you're not using numbers for any kind of a function, you're not talking about numbers to count, quantify, or label. We're just saying the word number. Simply saying the word number. That's what it means. For example, if someone says, "Can you write numbers in Korean?" Okay, in this kind of a context, I'm not asking you to count something with Korean numbers. I'm not asking you to quantify something using Korean numbers, and I'm not asking you to label something using Korean numbers. I'm just asking, don't do anything with the numbers. I'm just asking, do you know numbers? Okay, so in that case, 숫자. Okay, now this version 숫자 can also be used for another reason. Yeah, when you're in a context in which numbers are being used to quantify. Okay, so if A says the temperature dropped a lot, now B says, you can't just say that, that's too vague. You have to give me an exact number. Once again, temperature is not something that you count by saying how many, it's something that you quantify. So in this case, yeah, I'm gonna say, you have to give me an exact 숫자. Okay, now number 3, when you're in a context in which numbers are being used to count how many, in that case, 수. Okay, so for example, we need the number of people who came. Okay, so let's say we had some kind of like a concert yesterday. Okay, so we want to know exactly how many people came. Okay, so yeah, in this case, we're counting how many, right? I'm gonna say something like, how many people came yesterday? We need that number. Okay, so in that case, I'm gonna say we need the 수 of people who came. Okay, so number 4 is when you're using a number as a label, including any kind of a code number, like a password. In that case, 번호, and sometimes you would be able to use the abbreviation, the short version 번, but not always. We'll get to that part. Okay, so phone number, room number 2. Okay, so those numbers are being used as a label. Okay, so now that's why page number 2 says, yeah, before you start using actual numbers, learn how to say the word number first. So that's what we talked about in the first live. Okay, so today in the second live, we will actually talk about actual numbers then. Okay, so now, as you can see, there are 2 formats of numbers that are used in Korean, which means, of course, you have to know both of them, and also you have to know when to use which. When do I use this format and when do I use this format? Okay, so yeah, one is called native Korean numbers, one is called Sino numbers. Okay, so let's start with native Korean numbers. Okay, so now, as you can see, there is a variable that you have to keep in mind when it comes to native Korean numbers. Yeah, the ones in red. It says, in red, a separate format of numbers that are used when simply saying numbers. This phrase sounds similar, right? We just talked about it. This means when you're not using numbers for any kind of a function, you're not doing anything with it. Like, you're not counting, you're not quantifying, you're not labeling. Okay, so when simply saying numbers without any kind of a counting or quantifying unit, that's what that means. Okay, so yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4 have red versions. So if you're not using numbers to count, quantify, label, nothing, I'm just saying numbers, then 하나, 둘, 셋, 넷. However, if you are using numbers to count, for example, then 한, 두, 세, 네. Okay, so for example, let's say, yeah, you could say, what do you mean by just simply saying actual numbers? Yeah, this is an example that I often use. Let's say I'm making a movie. So yeah, I need a person who will play a character that gets very, very angry in one scene. Now, that scene is very important. So, when actors are auditioning for this role, I always ask them, yeah, can you yell for me? Can you get super angry? I just want to see how you sound when you're super angry, yelling. Okay, so I'm gonna say, just say anything. It doesn't matter. Just say 1, 2, 3, 4 for me, but in an angry voice. Okay, so in that case, yeah, I'm not asking you to use numbers to count, quantify, or label. I'm just saying, just say 1, 2, 3, 4. I just want to hear your voice. Okay, so in that case, this person should say 하나, 둘, 셋, 넷. Okay, so, but if we once again are using numbers for an actual function, then 한, 두, 세, 네, and all the other ones. Okay, so now, native Korean numbers, as you can see, yes, you might notice something. There is no number over 100. It says 90 and 9. So, yeah, it goes up to 99. Why is that? Because usually native Korean numbers will only be used up to 99. Yeah, starting from 100 and going up, bigger numbers than 100, you would usually use Sino numbers. Well, that means, yeah, if it's under 100, yes, you have to know when to use which. Okay, but if it goes over 100, starting 100, yes, only Sino numbers. Okay, so now let's talk about then, when do you use Sino numbers and when do you use native Korean numbers then? Okay, so let's go to page number 5 then. Okay, so a little while ago, we talked about the 3 typical functions that numbers have. Okay, counting, quantifying, and labeling. Okay, so native Korean numbers are for counting how many. Sino numbers are for quantifying and labeling. Okay, so if that's a little bit too vague, yes, now when I say counting, look at it this way. Now, in Korean, as you can see here, I said when we were starting this number course, I said the goal of this number course is to have 3 technical questions answered in a very technical and methodical way. Okay, and one of those questions were, why is in Korean knowing how to say two and book not enough to say 2 books? Because, yeah, in Korean, when you're counting how many, or quantifying, of course, but let's focus on counting how many right now. When you're counting how many, you have to have, usually, outside of very rare exceptions, you have to have some kind of a counting unit. So, when you're saying 2 books, that's not enough. You're actually saying 2 kwons of books. 책 2 권. So, 2 kwons of books. Okay, so just like when you say, like 2 cups of coffee. Okay, so yes, kwon is a unique counting unit only for books when you're counting how many. Okay, so this is a little tip. If you are a little bit confused, am I counting, quantifying, or labeling? Well, take a look at the unit that you're using. And ask yourself, okay, the unit that I'm using is kwon. What is this unit for? It's for books. Now, is a book, are books something that I can count by saying how many? Yeah, because I can literally say, how many books did you read last year? Okay, so if that works, if the unit you are using is for something that can be counted by saying how many, then yes, you are counting. Therefore, you use native Korean numbers. Okay, so that's why in this case I used 2, which is, yeah, 2, but in native Korean numbers, when you are counting, it's not 둘, right? I am using numbers to count, so it should be 2, not 둘. Okay. So, on the other hand, what if you are quantifying or labeling? Okay, so if you are a little bit confused, yeah, do the exact opposite. So, you will have some kind of a unit. So, in this case, temperature, 30도. Degrees in Korean Celsius, but anyway, 도 degrees for temperature. So ask yourself the same question. What is this unit for? It's for temperature. Is temperature something that you count by saying how many? Yeah, do you say, how many temperatures do we have today? Of course not. Yeah, when you're trying to check the temperature, you don't say, how many temperatures do we have? Of course not. So if that doesn't work, yeah, when you're using numbers for things or situations that are not counted by saying how many, yeah, then you are quantifying or labeling. So in that case, you use Sino numbers. Okay, so also that's why for phone numbers, you're labeling. When you say, my phone number is 01029 something something. Now, you're not saying, yeah, this is how many phone numbers I have. Let's say your phone number is, let's just say 322, whatever. Yeah, when you say, my phone number is 322, I'm not saying, yeah, I have 322 phone numbers. I'm not counting how many. Okay, so that's why when you are quantifying and labeling, yes, whatever you are talking about will not be counted by saying how many. Therefore, you use sino numbers. Okay, so now, of course, there will be some exceptions. Yes, let's look at, well, yeah, these are not the only exceptions, but the typical ones. Okay, so now you could say, okay, so you said if you're using numbers for things or situations that are not counted by saying how many, then time should fall into the sino category, right? My answer is yeah, because you don't say, how many time do we have left? Oh, 30 minutes? Thank you. You don't say that, right? With time, you don't say how many. So therefore, yes, you're quantifying. Therefore, it should be sino numbers. But there is one exception. Yeah, as you can see here, yeah, sino is in orange, right? And native in blue. Yeah, yes, most units for time, minute, second, year, month, week, day, etc., yes, will usually be in sino numbers, as they should. However, hour, this one unit is an exception. It will follow, yes, native Korean numbers. It will use native Korean numbers. Okay, so that's why if someone says, what is my record? Okay, so let's say we're training some kind of sport and someone says, what is my record? And I'm going to say, oh, it took you 2 hours, 2 minutes, and 2 seconds. Okay, so only hour will be in native Korean numbers. 2시간, 2분, 2초. Okay, so hour, minute, second, 222. 2시간, 2분, 2초. Okay, so that's what I mean by hour being an exception out of all the time units. Okay. So that's why only hour is in blue here. And another one, colloquial, in other words, conversational Korean, not poetic Korean, not soldier Korean, and not professional Korean, for example. And of course, no exam Korean. Okay, so yeah, in conversational Korean, yeah, age will be also an exception, because you could say, once again, okay, now, you did say that, yeah, if you're using numbers for things or situations that are not counted by saying how many, it should be sino numbers, right? Yeah, so it should be sino numbers, but it's native Korean numbers. That's why it's an exception. Because you don't say, how many ages are you? Of course, you don't do that, right? So yeah, it should be sino. But in conversational colloquial Korean, yes, when you're talking about age, it's an exception. It will use native Korean numbers. Meaning, for example, if you are using professional Korean, then it will be different. So, yeah, in conversational Korean, you use this unit, 살. So you're saying something like 49 sals of age. But if it's in professional Korean, everything will be different. You will use sino numbers in professional Korean, as you should, and the unit will also be different. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so keep in mind, only in colloquial, in other words, conversational Korean. Number 3, yes. Now, when you're talking about times, this is also an exception. Now, you could say, didn't we talk about time? No, we talked about time, but we didn't talk about times. Okay, so when I'm saying times, I'm saying when you say something like, how many times did you practice? How many times did you come here? Okay, so in that case, yeah, you can count this by saying how many, right? I just literally did it. I said, how many times did you come here? Yes, so usually when you're saying that, it should be native Korean numbers. And it is native Korean numbers when you are speaking spoken colloquial Korean. However, in professional Korean, yes, it's an exception. It breaks the rule. Okay, so in professional Korean, when you're saying, I did it 17 times, then it will follow sino numbers, even though it should be following native Korean numbers. And the unit is 회 in professional Korean, but in conversational colloquial Korean, it will be different. Also, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so that's how you know when you use native Korean numbers versus sino numbers. Okay, does that make sense? If it does, 계속할까요? Should we continue? Okay. So, yes, we did briefly talk about how to know when to use native versus Sino. Okay, so now, well then, let's actually talk about some numbers. Let's start with native Korean numbers. Okay, so yeah, let's focus on native Korean numbers for a little bit and try to build a couple of numbers and also get used to a couple of concepts that come with using native Korean numbers. Okay, so now, once again, I did mention it briefly a little while ago. Yes, in Korean, when you're counting something, yeah, there's always going to be a counting unit. Okay, so you can't say 3 markers, 3 cars, 3 books, 3 people. No, it's always 3 something of books, 3 something of cars, 3 something of markers, and 3 something of people. So you have to know those counting units. Okay, so now, yeah, that's why when you're saying 14 people, knowing how to say 14 and people is not enough to say 14 people. You have to know 명, the counting unit. Yes, that is only used for people. Okay, so that's why it says 14명. Okay, so yeah, 열, I took 10 and then added 네. So what does that make? 14. 열네. And then 명. So 14 명s of people. Okay, so as you can see, that's how you use native Korean numbers. You put together a number and you pair it with some kind of a counting unit so that you can actually count something. But just like we took a look into some variables, the red format for 1, 2, 3, 4, there's another variable that you do have to keep in mind when you are using numbers to count, native Korean numbers, which is exactly 20. Okay, so when you are using the number exactly 20 and pair it with some kind of a counting unit to count, yeah, 스물 becomes 스무, but only when the number is exactly 20 plus a counting unit. So when you're saying something like, yeah, 20 명s of people, it won't be 스물, it's going to be 스무명. Okay, so yeah. So if the number is like 25, 28, 21, no, then it's just 스물. So if I'm going to say, yeah, 22 people, for example, I'm going to say 스물두명. So because the number is not exactly 20, I'm going to keep this version, the L version, 스물, and then add 두명. Okay, but if it's exactly 20, 스무명. Okay, so those are some variables that you have to keep in mind when it comes to using native Korean numbers. Okay, now let's focus on Sino numbers then. Okay, so with Sino numbers, yes, the first variable that I would like to talk about is 0. Okay, so in native Korean numbers, you do not use 0. If you want to use 0, you go to Sino numbers and use either 영 or 공. Okay, so actually, 영 started as the official version, but you would notice that a lot of times people use 공 as well. So it's kind of similar to a concept in English, right? For example, let's say I am at a hotel and someone says, "What is your room number?" I can say 702, right? Yeah, I can say 702. Okay, so it's a similar concept. Usually Korean phone numbers for just individual people, for an individual person, looks like this: 010 and then 4 numbers and then 4 numbers. Okay, so yeah, people usually say 010. So 010. Okay, because 공 in Korean means ball. When you say, yeah, basketball, baseball. Okay, so yeah, it looks like a ball. Okay, so that's why, yeah, you can say 010. And also, there are two perspectives. Yeah, you could think of it that way. You could memorize it that way because it looks like a ball. That's why people say 010. Now, if you do take a little bit of a more complicated route, which you don't have to, we're just doing this to provide you with a perspective that enables you to memorize it easily. But 공 also means empty. It's a way of saying empty. So 0 is an empty number. Okay, so that's also why, yes, 0 started to be called hung. Okay, so it depends on perspective. So yeah, you can just go whichever route you want that seems to help you memorize it more easily. Okay, so that's how you say 0 in Sino numbers. Okay, and once again, as I briefly talked about a little while ago, starting from 100, you only use Sino numbers. That's why you see these crazy big numbers. Okay, so like 10,000. Yeah, well, something like that. Okay, 2 million, 2 billion. Okay, so we'll talk about building big numbers, yeah, later. Okay, so right now, let's focus on building some reasonable numbers, okay, that you might actually use a lot when you are actually speaking in normal life conversations. Okay, so let's take a look at just a couple of examples. So, let's say this is how actually Koreans speak a lot. Let's say my friend is doing something. He has a task. Okay, so he has to get it done. Now, we were supposed to go get dinner together once he's done. So I'm looking at the clock. It's 8:30 p.m. Okay, so I'm waiting. Yeah, I think if we're gonna go get dinner, it has to be now. Okay, so yeah, I'm hungry. So I'm gonna ask my friend, "Are you almost done?" And my friend would say, "I did 40%. Okay, so I guess we're not gonna go get dinner. Anyway, that's not the point. That's not the point, right? Okay, so a little while ago I said you use native Korean numbers when you're counting and you use Sino numbers when you're quantifying or labeling. In other words, take a look at the unit that you're using. I'm using percent. Okay, so what is percent for? Always ask yourself, what is the unit for if you have a unit? Yeah, percent is for proportion, ratio, right? Now, when you talk about ratio, do you say how many? Do you count ratio by saying how many? Do you say how many ratios did you do? 40%? Do you do that? Do you do that? Is it a yes or no? Do you count ratio or proportion by saying how many? Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I wouldn't do that. So that tells me that I am either quantifying or labeling. Yes, in this case, quantifying, which tells me that I should use Sino numbers. Okay, exactly. I wouldn't do that. I'm quantifying. Okay, so of course, no I. It's going to be too obvious, right? So we have the verb. And now, when you have some kind of a unit for quantifying or counting, that unit is going to be a noun. Okay, so yeah, nouns can be objects, right? Just like you say, I drank coffee. I found it. I did 40%. Okay, so we're going to say, yeah, 40, but in Sino numbers. Okay, so yeah. Now, when you're building a number in Sino numbers, do this. You have 40. Now, look here. What's the biggest unit that I have in 40? Not 100, right? So the biggest unit is 10, 10. It's just that I need 4 of them. So I'm going to say 4, 10, 4 tens. Okay, so 4, 10. I'm sorry. And then, yeah, we are going to build a whole bunch of sentences in a whole bunch of situations to use a whole bunch of counting or quantifying units. But I'll just show you a glimpse of, yeah, the latter part of this course. Okay, yeah, page 11, we have percent for proportion, ratio as well, of course, in other words. Okay, so now, you could see people using 퍼센트, yeah, percent, just pronounced in a Korean way. But a lot of times it comes down to habit. But I would say, yeah, maybe about 50% of the time, or maybe even 60% of the time, you would hear people saying 프로. So something 프로, 70%, 40%, but also sometimes 70%, 40%. Okay, so where does this 프로 come from? Okay, well, yeah, a lot of words from, yes, Western countries came to Korea through Japan first. So it is known that the Dutch version, procent, came to Japan first, and then through Japan it came into Korea. So that's why it used to be procent. And yeah, people just took up until pro as an abbreviation for convenience. That's why, yes, even to this day, a lot of people say 프로. Okay, so 70%, 40%. So do not be confused. They are still talking about percent. Okay, about percentage. So yeah, it literally comes down to habit. I can say 40% or I can say 40%. And of course, I don't represent the whole group of people, but yeah, adults don't do it that often. So it's more of like a playful way like teenagers talk to each other. Yeah, but you can also use an abbreviation for 퍼센트, which is 퍼, 40%. Okay, but I do not really advise you to do it. Okay, so it's kind of like a playful way that teenagers talk to each other when they're texting or something. Okay, so it's either 퍼센트 or 프로. And then I'm gonna say do, 하다. But I don't want its display form. I want its actual form, past tense, right? So according to inflection route number 1, I'm not going to get into the details of inflection because for this course, I will focus on numbers. 했어요. Okay, so if I ask my friend, are you almost done? My friend can say, 40% 했어요. 40% 했어요. Okay, did 40% or 40% 했어요. 40% 했어요. Okay, does that make sense? If it does, 계속할까요? Should we continue? Okay. So, now, this is depending on perspective. Well, I wouldn't say necessarily off topic, but this time I'm not going to talk about numbers itself, but I'm going to talk about something that you have to know when you are using numbers. Okay, something that you could use when you are using numbers. Okay, so when you want to say about. Yeah, sometimes you're not really sure, right? You're not going to be super specific. You can say like about 40%, about 23 kilograms, or something like that. Okay, so of course there are a lot of ways of doing it, but I'm just going to talk about the big three today. Okay, so when you have some kind of a number and some kind of a counting or quantifying unit, so there's method number 1, which is to place 한 in front of the number. 한 40% 했어요. Did about 40%. Method number 2 would be to place 정도 behind the number and the unit. 40% 정도 했어요. Did about 40%. And method number 3 would be, yes, 쯤 or 쯤. Now, they are different. 달라요. They are not the same. But I am going to say, don't be too stressed about the difference between the two, memorizing it, because it's okay to make mistakes. Why? Because Koreans make a mistake all the time. Okay, so of course all Koreans know that there are both versions. There's 쯤 and there's 쯤. However, yeah, even a lot of Koreans think that, oh, wasn't 쯤 just like a short version of 쯤 for convenience? No, 쯤 technically is when that number is something about time. When you're saying something like, we need about 2 hours. 쯤 is when that number is not something about time. For example, when you're saying, yeah, we need about 10 people. Okay, so yeah, in this case, I'm not talking about time. This is not percentage. Percent is not a unit necessarily for time. So if I am going to use one of them, I should technically speaking use 쯤. But once again, even Koreans get it mixed up all the time. Okay, but it is good to know. Okay, so there are the big three, 한, 정도, or 쯤. But depending on habit, sometimes you could run into people who just have the habit of using two, one that goes in front of the number and one that goes behind. So 한 40% 정도 했어요. Or 한 40%쯤 했어요. Okay, so literally comes down to habit. It does not have a functional difference, doesn't have a nuance difference either. So what I'm talking about is using one or two at the same time does not have a functional difference or difference in nuance, literally comes down to habit. Okay, does that make sense? If it does, 계속할까요? Okay, let's continue then. So anyway, that's why in this case we used sino numbers, because when you're using percent as the unit, you're talking about proportion, you're talking about ratio, and ratio proportion is not something that you count by saying how many. Okay, so let's look at another example then. Now let's say my friend really likes running, or let's say I noticed that my friend really has good cardio. He doesn't get tired. So I'm going to ask, what's the secret? And he says, well, I run 3 now kilo. Okay, so yeah, let's go to the list of units one more time. Yeah, we will get here again, but page number 10. So, yeah, in Korean, the quantifying unit for distance and length. Yes, yeah, right now we're talking about kilometers, meters, centimeters. Okay, so yeah, when they are using kilometers for distance and length, for convenience, they will use a short version, kilo. Okay, of course that comes from kilometers. Okay, the first half of the word, kilo. Okay, so yeah, once again, when you're talking about distance, you don't count distance by saying how many, do you? Right? You don't say, yeah, how many distances do we still have to go? Of course you don't say that, right? So we're quantifying, we're not counting how many. Okay, so once again, sino numbers. Let's say I run 3 kilometers every day. Okay, so I have the verb, and I said all units can be nouns. Okay, and a noun can be an object, right? Subject, verb, object. So, no I, and time every day. Okay, so, yes, because I'm going to use sino numbers, yeah, I need 3, but yeah, this version, 삼. I don't need the native Korean version, right? Okay, so I'm gonna say, my friend would say, oh, how do I have such good cardio? Well, here's the secret. Yeah, I run 매일 3km and then 뛰다, but of course I don't want its display form. I want its actual form, present tense ending, right? The 요 ending, 뛰어요. Okay, 매일 3km 뛰어요. Okay, so I'm gonna say, to ask my friend, how do you have such good cardio? What's the secret? And my friend can say, well, 매일 3km 뛰어요. Okay, does that make sense? If it does, 계속할까요? Should we continue? Okay. This time, let's just slightly change the situation. Slightly. Now, I just asked my friend, what's the secret to your good cardio? But this time, I'm gonna ask, what's the secret to your happiness? You always look happy these days. Okay, so my friend, let's say this friend is a friend that I haven't seen for, let's say, about 3 years. The last time I saw him was 3 years ago. Now, 3 years ago, of course, well, yeah, he wasn't like depressed or anything, but 3 years later, you look very, very happy. Okay, so I'm gonna ask, what's the secret? What's going on? Now, he says, well, now I have cats. Okay, 3 years ago, I didn't, but now I have cats. Okay, so I'm gonna say, oh, cats? How many cats? Okay, so he's gonna say, I raise 4. And then 마리. once again, when you're counting how many in Korean, you always need some kind of a counting unit, right? Okay, so the counting unit for animals would be page number 6. Yes, 마리, 마리, 마리. Okay, so 강아지 세 마리, 3 마리's of dogs as a way of saying 3 dogs. Okay, so once again, as you can see, you always need some kind of a counting unit. You don't say 7 people, you say 7 명's of people, 3 마리's of dogs. Okay, so yeah, that's why I'm going to use I raise 4 마리 of cats. Okay, so yeah, we did talk about this a long time ago, right? Yeah, when people say something like, I have a cat, I have a dog, or something like that, when you're talking about a pet, you don't use the word there is or have, because if you do, it strongly gives off the nuance that I am treating this animal as an object, just like I treat this marker. Okay, so that's why, yeah, people say raised. Now, they will not necessarily use it in the literal sense. So it doesn't mean that they are literally a baby and they are being raised to be, an adult, for example. Of course, that's not the case. A lot of times they are not using it literally. They're just saying it as a way of saying have. I have a cat. I raise a cat. Okay, so we're going to say raise 4 마리. Okay, so once again, all counting units, nouns. So nouns can be objects. Subject, verb, object. Okay, now, 마리. Always ask yourself, if you have a unit, what is this unit for? Okay, 마리, what is it for? It's for animals. For example, in this case, cat. Okay, so are cats something that I can count by saying how many? Yeah, because I literally said it, right? I said, how many cats do you have? Okay, so the unit is for something that can be counted by saying how many. Exactly. So I am counting, therefore, I'm going to use native Korean numbers. Now, because I am actually using native Korean numbers to actually count, it's not going to be net, it's going to be ne. Okay, so net is going to be used when I'm not using a number for any kind of a function, not to count, not for anything. Okay, but in this case, I am using it to count, so ne. Okay, ne 마리. And then, 키우다. Of course, I don't want its display form. I want its actual form, present tense, the 요 ending. So, 키워요. So, 네 마리 키워요. 네 마리 키워요. 네 마리 키워요. Okay, does that make sense? If it does, 계속할까요? Should we continue? Okay. So, now, once again, just like we talked about how to say about with a number, I'm this time also going to talk about something that you can do when you're using numbers. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a simple question. Is 4 absolutely a big number or a small number? Okay, so I would say it depends, right? It's not absolutely a big number and it's not absolutely a small number either. No number is. Because if I was expecting 10 and I get 4, exactly depends. Now it's a small number. If I was expecting 1 but I get 4, now it's a big number. So that's why no number is absolutely a big or small number. Okay, but if someone uses this particle with a number and a unit, 이나 or 나. Okay, so there are a couple of things that these particles can do. They are particles, therefore they have to be attached to some kind of a word. They don't do anything alone. Okay, so there are a couple of things that they can do. And, well, typically 3. And one of them is to be attached to some kind of a number and a unit to indicate that the speaker is viewing the number as a big number, therefore is surprised or even shocked. Okay, so yes. Now, let's say my friend says, oh, I raised 4마리's of cats. 4마리 키워요. So let's say I am super surprised. Oh my god, 4? I was expecting 1 or 2. So if I'm gonna give off the nuance that I am viewing 4 as a big number, I can attach 4마리나 키워요. Okay, so now, because I placed this particle here, I don't have to act surprised anymore. I don't have to look surprised. I don't have to sound surprised either. So that's why a lot of times you have to be able to read nuance from the language. That's why when you're reading nuance in Korean, you should not rely on nonverbal expressions like tone of voice or like facial expressions or like gestures, because I can sound very calm and collected. Okay, but the fact that I placed na here indicates that I am very surprised because I look at 4 as a very big number. So I don't have to make it sound like I'm saying, oh my god, you have 4 cats? I don't have to sound animated like that. Okay, so that's what this particle automatically does. Okay, so 네 마리나 키워요. But what if I remember this friend as a friend who used to have, let's say, 19 dogs. Okay, so let's say me and my friend, let's say we are, 52. I used to be friends with him when we were teenagers. Okay, so when we were teenagers, I remember that he had 19 dogs. Okay, so after a long time, I meet him again, and he says, now I have cats. Now, because the fact that he used to have 19 dogs, I was, in my mind, I was picturing like, oh, he must have like 20 cats again. But then he says 4. So now, depending on the context, now I'm no longer viewing 4 as a big number because I was expecting 20. Okay, so now I cannot use this particle then. Okay, so this is a little bit off topic. It's not just about numbers, but maybe it is because it's something that you can do with numbers. Okay, so that's why I always say so many misunderstandings happen because of the fact that it's hard to read nuance. Okay, because, for example, let's say my friend is supposed to, let's say my friend / colleague. Yeah, we're working in the same office. Now, let's say today we're gonna have some guests coming over for like a business meeting from a different company. So let's say my friend / colleague was in charge of setting up the meeting room, but let's say he didn't know exactly how many people would come. So let's say he's busy doing that. Now he comes to me and says, did they arrive? Did our guests arrive? And I'm gonna say, oh yeah, I think they did. Yeah, I see them there. Yeah, 10 people came. 10명 왔어요. So native Korean numbers for people. Because this unit is for people, I can count people by saying how many. How many people came? 10명 왔어요. 10 people came. Okay, but what if, I say this and my friend says 10명이나 왔어요? Okay, so now what does this tell me? This is giving me so much information. Yes, because let's say I didn't know what this was doing, or I thought that this really doesn't make like a huge difference. So let's say I said, 10 people came. Now that's not what I should have done. What I should have done immediately is, how can I help you? Because by my colleague saying 10명이나 왔어요, he, very clearly told me that 10 is a big number because I was not expecting 10. Which means that I am underprepared right now. So the moment he said this, I should have said, how can I help you? Do you need more chairs? Do you need more coffee? What's going on? Okay, so always reading nuance is the most important. Now, whenever I talk about anything, I always say nuance is number 1, right? Yeah, numbers, no exception. Okay. Now, let's take a look at another example then. So let's say this time me and my 친구 are at a 식당, a restaurant. Okay, now my friend is taking forever to choose what he wants. Okay, so let's say we have this menu here. My friend is taking forever. So, of course, I want to wait, but let's say we were sitting here for, let's say, 28 minutes, just thinking about what he wants. Okay, so we're sitting here for 28 minutes. So I'm gonna say, hey, I don't know, just order number 6. Yeah, at this point, come on. Yeah, okay, so just order number 6. Okay, so now, I'm that friend. Okay. So, let's go back to page number 2 for a little bit. So, when we were talking about 2, when we were talking about numbers being used as a way of labeling, including coding, okay, some kind of a password, I said 번호, but sometimes you would see a short version 번 as well. Right now, I'm going to talk about, when you would see 번. So, sometimes you could see people saying number plus number, number plus number. Okay, so okay. No, I mean, you can, as long as your friend is, willing to wait, Okay, so, I mean, of course, I don't know, 28 minutes? I'm not sure about that, Okay, anyway, so, sometimes you would say number plus number, not like, number and percent, not like number and degrees, like 30 degrees, 12%, or 14 kilometers. Not like number plus some kind of a unit. Sometimes you would be saying number plus number, number plus number. When you're saying something like number 3, number 5. So when I say number and number, I mean the word number and a real number. Okay, so in this case, when you're saying number plus number, the number, the word number, you would use 번, the short version. So 3번, 3번. Okay, and this would be done when you are using numbers to label. Okay, so that's why we're going to use Sino numbers. So I'm going to say, just order number 6. Okay, so because you can obviously tell that I am not counting, right? I'm not saying order 6 menus. How many menus should I order? Order 6. Of course, I'm not saying that. And I'm not quantifying how spicy, for example, menu number 6 is. No, I'm just saying, hey, this menu right here is labeled number 6. Right? For convenience, so that you can just say number 6 or number 1, number 3, whatever. Okay, so it's a label. So that's why we're going to use Sino numbers. Okay. So, yes. 6, 6, 6. Okay, so I'm going to say 6, and then when you're saying number plus number, once again, 번. 번, number 3, number 6. So 6번. So I'm going to say 그냥, hey, just order number 6. 그냥 6번. Okay, number 6. And then 시키다, a version of order. Okay, but of course I don't want its display form. I want its actual form in present tense. So I'm going to say, 그냥 6번 시켜요. Okay, 그냥 6번 시켜요. Okay, 그냥 6번 시켜요. 6번 시켜요. Okay, does that make sense? If it does, 계속할까요? Should we continue? Okay. So, that's exactly how then you know how to use, when to use, I should say, when to use native Korean numbers versus Sino numbers. Okay, so you do have to train yourself to, be instantly able to identify which version you are using, because knowing when to use which and pulling out the right format of numbers and the exact number within that format instantly when you're on the spot speaking spontaneously, that's a completely different story. Okay, so yeah, you have to train yourself. Okay, try to find, oh, here it is. Okay, so once again, yeah, knowing which format of numbers you should go to and finding the number within that format. Of course, knowing how to do that is one thing. Now, can you pull out that right number immediately when someone is looking at you with silence, waiting for your answer? Yeah, if you can, yeah, knowing how to pull out the right number immediately, effortlessly within that situation, it's a completely different story. Of course, which means that, yeah, you have to practice a lot until it feels effortless. Okay, so yeah, that was it for today's second class. Now, in the third class, yeah, we're going to do basically the same thing. However, we're going to start building bigger numbers and use more units. Okay, for practice, we're going to make a whole bunch of sentences.